instead of making our bodies trying to cookie cutter ourselves into a form that we're told to practice, instead we make that form be expressed by our own bodies, by our own anatomy and our own different proclivities. I mean, yeah, some people have limitations, some people have excessive skills, and some people have limited skills in some areas. Learning not to exploit our skills becomes another journey. What is our anatomy? What is our natural design telling us to do?
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. We've got a great show in store for today. We're going to be talking a lot about the postural practice of yoga. And our guest is Steven Weiss. He's a holistic chiropractor and nutritionist. He's a yoga therapist and teacher with over 35 years of professional and yoga practice experience. He teaches anatomy, alignment principles, yoga therapeutics, and nutrition for yoga teacher trainings in the United States and internationally. And for 17 years, he'd been the resident chiropractor and nutritionist with the Omega Institute for Holistic Studies in New York State, where he continues to serve as a visiting yoga faculty member to this day. He's also the author of the book, The Injury-Free Yoga Practice, a comprehensive guide to alignment, anatomy, and the prevention of yoga injuries. I'm a big fan of his book, and I'm excited to have a fellow anatomy geek on the show today. Steven, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ashton. It's fun to be here. Looking forward to it.
So before we dive into the topic, if you could maybe tell our listeners a little bit about your backstory, your experience with yoga, you're a chiropractor as well, how you got involved with it all and started to integrate them together.
Yeah, sure. Well, around just at 1980, I began to practice chiropractic, and at the same time began to practice yoga a little bit before that, but then I started to really get into it. And for many years, I was working as a chiropractor and working with people's injuries and conditions they came in with. And then I'd go and after practice, go to yoga class, and never really saw much of the connection between the two. It took a good 10 years or so. And I had begun working with the Omega Institute in New York, where there are many yoga programs every week, and some of the top names in the yoga world come through and do their programs. And I began to notice when I do yoga class in the morning with all these different students, later they'd come to me, and some of the teachers as well, they'd come to me in the afternoon, and I'd start to see their injuries, and I start to wonder, well, what is it in the yoga practice that is either causing injuries or not helping to heal their injuries? And it probably took another couple of years, but then just one day it all kind of came together. I think I was in a headstand at the time in an Iyengar class, and all of a sudden it all seemed to make sense how powerful the asana practice is as a therapeutic for almost all structural conditions that I've been working with as a chiropractor. And since then, I've been really integrating the two and finding there's this great harmony and really seeing yoga as one of the most sophisticated alignment delivery systems, even more than what I was doing as a chiropractor. I was looking at how powerful these tools of yoga asana are, and then began to put it together, codify it in a way that people could use it. I could use it as a practitioner. I could teach it, and students could use it in their day-to-day practice as well.
You said a few things in there, and I definitely want to clarify for ourselves, because I think when we're talking about yoga or even the postural practice, I think a lot of people get into conversations about right or wrong or this or that, and really they're kind of talking about something different anyways. I think what's really helpful is to establish when in any particular conversation of yoga asana, when we're talking, what we view as the purpose of the asana? Because if someone has the purpose that it's about the transcendent, well, then it doesn't really matter if you're damaging your body or not, because if the point of the asana is to get past it to some other state, well, then that's a different conversation. What is the purpose of asana, of the postures?
That's a great question. First, I work with a very traditional definition or image, metaphor, let's say, of yoga, and that's the union of the body and mind. And that yoking or union requires for the body and the mind to come together and to integrate. It requires some type of communication. So the mind has to talk to the body has to talk to the mind, and there's this constant network or feedback loop going on. The way I see it, the way the body-mind integrates and communicates, it's through alignment. It's through the mind telling the body, well, this is what we're attempting to do, and the body's feeding back and saying, well, I'm attempting to do it, and it's feeling good, or it's creating this kind of discomfort, or I don't have the strength in this position, or I don't have the flexibility. And this banter, let's say, goes back and forth. But the more the body and the mind can use this language of alignment, then we're working with the same system. And then we start to find that we have this integration, and that brings it to yoga, makes it a yogic experience. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's helpful the way I explained it that way, but that's kind of where I start with it.
Well, and you mentioned alignment there, and that's definitely something I want to dive into today in our chat a bit. But before we do that, there's a question that I have with a lot of teachers as well, and I want to hear, because it ties into what we're talking about. Do you feel that all asana needs to be or is supposed to be therapeutic?
Well, there's a lot of controversy as to how many asana there are. And, I've heard up to 8.4 million potential asana. Mm-hmm. So perhaps some of those asana may not necessarily be delivering therapy, but most of the things we do on the mat, most of the physical practice, I think of it this way. I think, if you think about the yamas and the niyamas, and how we, the yamas particularly, how we don't want to do harm, and we want to have wisdom in our poses, and we don't want to steal. So therefore, in our yoga practice, we don't want to be. Let's say if I'm not flexible in my hip, but instead I steal the flexibility of my ankle to go into a pose like lotus, then very much I think we have to work with our anatomy, work with our natural design, work with our alignment. Otherwise, I don't think it's yoga anymore. At that point, if we're not listening to the messages, then we're violating, Patanjali's, yama principles. And so what are we doing at that point? So anything structural, anything physical, the Hatha practice, I really think requires us working with the natural design, or we're no longer in the world of yoga. Yeah.
And so you talk about alignment a lot, and you've mentioned a few times already. What do you consider to be good alignment? I think we're limited in some context of being an audio show, so we're not looking about pictures. But I don't mean, in that one pose, what is good alignment? But do you have something that you consider to be? Because I in your writing and some of the things I've listened to you with as well, you talk about good alignment. What do you consider to be good alignment for people?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's. For many years, I studied Iyengar Yoga, and we would learn 20 or 30 different cues for a pose. And after a few hours, okay, I got into that pose, it's great. And then we go on to the next asana, and then the next. And nowhere along the way were we told or enlightened to the place where the alignment cues and principles are repetitive. And it really took the Anusara world to come along to eventually say, you know what? There's actually one system of alignment for the body. There's one set of universal principles. And there aren't really that many. There's maybe, 30, 40 principles. And they apply to every single posture, every single asana that we take. In fact, every asana is essentially Tadasana, the mountain pose, just being in a new manifestation and a new opportunity to challenge myself. How can I find my alignment that I create in Tadasana? How can I find it now that I'm twisted or upside down or in some new configuration? Mm-hmm. And I always want to go back to the basic principles that I established in mountain pose. So for me, that's where it all starts. So alignment is going to be found in the basic principles that we establish when we just stand in our Tadasana.
Hmm. And so then with that in mind, what causes poor alignment? Is it simply a matter of biomechanics? Is it, issues with functioning in the brain? Is it a mental state? Is it a combination of all those? In your work, what do you notice? What do you see?
Well, just as they say in North America, 70 to 80% of people will experience back pain in their lives. Unfortunately, we don't live in a lifestyle where our bodies are well supported. No one's around to teach us how to sit well, walk well. I used to be a competitive runner, and many people never learned how to run correctly. It would take a lot of coaching and a lot of skills to develop efficiency. Just like muscles require efficiency to work well, our bodies, our yoga practice is all about efficiency as well. So we don't really learn how to move our bodies correctly. Unfortunately, I've seen people practice yoga for years without giving some basic instructions, and their poses never evolve. And sometimes they're doing poses in such an incorrect way that they're just leading to the wear and tear. And instead of the yoga being something that helps them, it actually is just causing these long-term chronic injuries to develop. Anyway, so that's kind of how I look at it with that. One other thing I just want to say is that one of the things we get caught up sometimes in is that we think about the form of the pose. What's the outer appearance of the pose? Where are we supposed to, does the arm go in the air? Do the legs spread apart? Do they go forward, back? And we have these gross appearances of poses. And if we spend a lot of time either instructing as a teacher from the form of the pose, from the outer appearance, and we forget the fact that there's something else going on, which is the interaction of the pose, then we're not teaching those alignment principles. So there are two different things. There's the outer form and there's the interaction. And the interaction is more of your anatomy, the movement of your joints, the physiology of movement, how your ligaments function, your muscles work. And if a yoga student can learn the basic action, so when I move my arm, what is taking place in my arm, the range of motion, how are the ligaments either getting tight or loose, what muscles are pulling. And not like you have to memorize all the terms, but if you have a basic sense and picture of the interaction, then you can take that interaction to every movement that you do in every pose that you do.
Well, and if using that language, would you say that the interaction is actually much more important than the outer form?
Oh, completely. I think there's one set of actions, and the outer form are just provocations. We're just provoking the body. Can you continue to move with the interactions while you get into more and more complex situations?
And something that I see a lot is that people get caught up in the thought behind what a posture is supposed to look like. And so they try to force their body however their mechanics and their habits and their patterns take them there. So it's not anything new. It's just, okay, I'm supposed to look like that, and so let me crank there. And it might be that their body will never, ever look like that particular image they're looking at because of the structure of their bones, the shape of their body, their lifestyle, everything else. So instead of trying to crank into that outward form, as you said, by learning the actions of what the pose is actually asking for, it might look quite different, but you know that they're stable, that they're going to be supportive, and that hopefully that when things are united in that way, that you are creating health instead of any type of dis-ease or discomfort in the body, for sure.
Yes, no, I love that. That's exactly how I feel about it. instead of making our bodies trying to cookie cutter ourselves into a form that we're told to practice, instead we make that form be expressed by our own bodies, by our own anatomy and our own different proclivities. I mean, yeah, some people have limitations, some people have excessive skills, and some people have limited skills in some areas. Learning not to exploit our skills becomes another journey, so that if we think we have to get extremely flexible in a pose, sometimes we'll exploit that at the sake of forming stability. And, therefore we're not listening to our bodies. We have to find that balance. We have to work with what is our anatomy? What is our natural design telling us to do? And whatever the appearance eventually looks like, so be it. That's wonderful.
Well, that's something I encounter a lot as well, where there seems to be the perception in yoga that more flexibility equals better. And so people continue to seek out flexibility, as you said, often at the expense of stability and strength, and they can often be causing more harm that way. I mean, seeking maximum flexibility for flexibility's sake is the same as just seeking strength for strength's sake without having any range of motion or flexibility in the tissue. So it goes either way, and you definitely see, or I definitely see, a lot of people in the yoga community pushing so much towards that flexibility side, the range side, that they are lacking a lot of stability. And so it takes time, sometimes months or years, to get people who've been practicing for a really long time to step back and find that grounding stability back in their body. And it also tends to translate in their lives as well, but it really makes an impact in the physical body.
Yeah, no, you're right on with that. And, I found as a chiropractor and working physically with people, if somebody is stiff and tight, it's a lot easier to work with, creating more mobility. In fact, most of what the classical form of chiropractic is to increase mobility in joints that have become stuck. It's a lot more difficult in everything we do to stabilize. If somebody is overstretched, if they have, strained or, ligaments that no longer have their elasticity to them, it's very hard to create stability again. Many people started yoga years ago who are quite flexible, and I've worked with people who are been long-time yoga practitioners. I've been working with people who are Cirque du Soleil contortionists, and I can tell you that instability is a lot harder of something to deal with in your life than just being a little bit stiff, because we can always move forward with our stiffness, but that instability, that's a tough one to eventually stabilize again.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you see, given your extensive amount of time that you've been in the field and in your work and all the teaching that you do, anything that you notice that's pretty common in postural yoga classes that people are doing that is potentially injurious? Like anything that perhaps we could say I see a lot of people doing this thing, and with just this little bit of awareness that it might help to address that situation?
Yes, yeah. As you say, it comes to mind, I guess, I think the two primary things I see. But first I'll start maybe with the lower torso, and that's the idea that we have quite limited hip extension. So that means when we bring the leg behind the body, a pose like Nataraj, the dancer pose, even when we're in a camel pose and trying to lean back, even though we're attempting to keep our hips directly over our knees, there's a sense of extension in there. Dhanurasana, Urdhva Dhanurasana. Anatomists at one point felt there was no extension in the hip joint itself. And it took a number of years before they figured out, well, there's only about 10 to 20 degrees of true hip extension. Passively, you can get it maybe another 10. So anyway, when people are in poses and they try to do, let's say they're standing and they're trying to do dancer pose, maybe just, with the one hand and straight in front, the prep portion, they often will bring the knee behind them, and they'll sometimes never even get any extension into that back leg, or just a few degrees. There's only about 10 degrees when the knee is bent anyway. But then they steal the pose from the lower back. So because the lumbar spine is already in hyperextension or already in extension, it's really easy to hyperextend it to now be able to reach your foot and bring it up into the position and not even attempt to really get any true hip extension activated. So I say that's one of the first things I see is because we're limited in our hip extension, we steal flexibility from our lumbar spine, and the result of that is we compress the lumbar spine and damage the discs in the lumbar spine because of that.
Well, and I would add to that too, since a lot of people don't globally extend the spine very well, not only is it hyperextension happening in the low back, but it tends to be at areas like T12 and L1 or L4, L5, those points where they move around a more flexible point and they create even more damage to the discs at that point. Because you see a lot of hinging of the back instead of again, the spine doesn't universally extend because of the difference of mobility of the lumbar, thoracic, and cervical spine. But you definitely notice that big hinging factor. And you can see where even the fascial lines in their body have almost frozen into that line where you can see that's where they move from their body. They're not even really moving from where it's not getting distributed across the back. It's just going from that one point. But what would you suggest then for people to address that?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I would work with is that they do quadricep stretching. So whether they do sit in virasana or put their what we call the intense quad stretch against the wall, where your leg is coming up in that virasana.
That's like the money pose. That is one of the greatest poses to get people in. If the people can't feel a quad stretch, you get them in that one, and that one's just like, oh, those are my quads. But yeah,
exactly. Yeah, so that's the one. And I think it's, again, this is where it comes to the yogic part. It's like if I just want to move unconsciously, then when I go into a pose and I bring my leg behind me and I start to rock my pelvis forward and arch my back, I grab my foot and I'm in the pose and I think, oh, yahoo, I'm doing Nataraj. But the trauma, the lack of ahimsa in the pose is pretty overt. Like you said, people become kind of pointed at T12 and they compress their fifth lumbar. So anyway, what I would do is I would have the person do a lot of stretching of the quads. And I also found, and as someone who was a competitive runner for many years, I've had very tight hamstrings. And the only thing that really helped me make progress was to get into stretching my quads. Until I got into my quads, my hamstrings were never letting go. And now finally I have something that resembles, a functional hamstring stretch.
There's an image I often use with that where you've got two sides of the tug of war, and since the roughly the quads and the hamstrings are agonist antagonistic in that relationship, where you've got two sides pulling on the tug of war, and when one side wins, that side is pulled all short. They've drawn the rope into their bodies, where the other side is, their arms are all lengthed out, their body's all pulled forward. And in that image, it's the quads that are the ones that are really short and they've got the rope close to the body, and the hamstrings are all pulled really long. And so when you try to pull on the hamstrings more, it feels like, oh my gosh, this is so intense, because they're already pulled at such a dramatic length. When the quads, you start pulling them, they've got all this room to still open because they've been pulled shorter. And I find, like you said, the big one is helping to stretch the quads, but even often people just strengthening their hamstrings, not even stretching them, I notice has a really big effect, as long as they're also doing that in conjunction with opening up the quads. It can really make a huge difference. It's funny, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but you mentioned running and a few of the other things about alignment, and it's something that I see so much, and it's such a shame where when people will go, okay, I'm getting pain in running right now, so I'm either going to go to a specialist, or they go to the special running stores and they have somebody talk about, they usually either say, like, a doctor says, well, you're in pain, stop doing it, which is great advice, I'm sure, but if you just leave it right there, unfortunate. Or you go to the shoe or a shoe store or a running store, and what do they usually do is they just put them in more expensive shoes, they put more cushioning underneath their feet, very it's not very often they actually look at their mechanics. It's like, well, let's just look at how you're running. Oh, well, you're taking these gigantic strides and landing on your heel every time. Of course you're going to be in pain when you run. And it's so often just these little tweaks can make such a difference, and you don't need all this expensive, fancy stuff. All it is, and it's similar in asana too, in yoga. It's like sometimes it's just these little tweaks to your mechanics, and they make such a huge impact on the body.
Yeah, they really do. For about 15 years, I taught a class I called it the Way of the Peaceful Runner, and basically we took people for runs, and we looked at their alignment when they ran the same way I would look at someone's alignment in mountain pose, and it's the same. It's really the same set of principles. Are they where are their knees in relation to their hips and ankles, and are they drawing their shins inward, engaging the peroneus muscles, and are they broadening the inner groins, and where's the relationship of their shoulders and their elbows over the side body and things like that. But I found, and then engaging bandhas and breath work was very powerful for that too. So yeah, I think yoga, as I always say, we could be yoga 24/7. We've been doing yoga, and I really think it is just not only a way of life, but it's a way of it's the operating system for our body as far as I see it. So, it's right there. And the language of that operating system, of course, is all these things that we're talking about. One more thing I just wanted to say when we're talking about the exploitation or the the stealing of the lumbar spine extension. One of the ways we want to prevent that, and there are many, many ways to give an analogy for that, but I would say to keep it simple, the idea that we engage Mula Bandha and Uddiyana Bandha at the same time.
Which is the root lock and the abdominal lock for people that might not know the words, yeah.
Yeah, no, good, thank you for that. And, we engage Mula Bandha, the root lock, by simply gently scooping the tailbone forward. There are many ways to engage it, but this concept of gently forward scooping the tailbone under your body toward your pubic bone, that engages Mula Bandha. It also stabilizes your SI joints, your sacroiliac joints, so it prevents injury there. It also prevents your pelvis from over-rocking forward. So if I was trying to bring my leg back behind me into hip extension, which wants to arch my back, if I scoop my tailbone under, or engage Mula Bandha, or the image of zippering up the zipper on your pants, those things prevent the pelvis from rocking forward and keeps your sacroiliac more stable. If you draw your belly button in gently, that will prevent your lumbar spine from increasing and compressing into the back body. And then if you engage Uddiyana Bandha, which I find is actually taking the tip of the breastbone and softly drawing it back, because that's where your diaphragm attaches. And actually, your bandhas correspond to the diaphragms. So if you let your rib cage draw back and the tip of your breastbone in the front body, drawing it back, that engages Uddiyana Bandha, and that prevents all that stress on that T12 area that wants to spike up and swivel too much in these poses. Mm-hmm. So my little mantra is scoop the tailbone, scoop in the breastbone, and draw in the navel. And that prevents us from overarching the low back and keeps it much healthier in everything we do.
What would you say? Because one of the things that I think, especially with yoga teachers, and after whether they've had a natural interest in it before or not, but once they start to go down the anatomy wormhole, as it were, which is just an endless hole that keeps getting bigger the further down you go in it. But the more you start learning about the body, the more, for perhaps a lack of a better word, the more personalized it is, or the more individual we recognize everything is, every posture is. How do you feel about the kind of modern sense of teaching group classes versus more one-on-one? It's difficult too. I know you're a yoga therapist. It is extremely difficult to do yoga therapy in a group setting because you've got multiple people that need a lot of different actions in their body to find that similar shape and pose. Is that something that you struggle with? Is that something that you've found a way kind of around that, or are you only teaching smaller classes? How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel that it comes down to communication. And I think even in a larger class, you can distribute information that people can use. And just like everyone knows, sometimes we have to hear something 5 times in 5 different ways, and then finally we go, that's it. That's what he was trying to tell me. And so here's what it comes down to. I think that the best way to impart this information, one is, as we've mentioned, keep it simple. That's important. The language. Sometimes you say, okay, I'm going to talk about anatomy, and people think, you announce there's a pop math quiz coming up or something, and they get a little freaky about it. But I think if you don't get caught up in the language and you see that, no, I am applying this anatomy, this physiology directly to my body, and not just directly to my body, but I'm applying it to something that's important in my life. My yoga poses. I want my poses to be better. I don't want to feel sore afterwards. I maybe want to help my shoulder or something that's been injured. I want it to feel better. So I'm invested. And now if the teacher can communicate well and can say, okay, I'm going to teach this one concept today. Maybe like we talked about, not hyperextending the hip, not hyperextending the lumbar spine, but learning to move from your hip socket instead. And we work with that one concept throughout the class. And, all the warrior poses, and there's so many poses that we can work with that same concept. Well, I think by the end of an hour and a half of class, people kind of got it. They've had maybe 15 or 20 different ways to experience this one principle that you tried to teach. Like one of the principles I like is we want to move from the core because the periphery is going to move a lot faster and farther than the core moves. And if you move from the periphery, like if I move from my hand instead of from my heart, then I'm never going to open my chest. I'm never going to get my shoulder into position, and my hand will be up into like a triangle pose. It'll be in position, but yet my chest may still be facing the floor, and that's pure trauma for my shoulder. So if I just took, let's say, that one principle, and in every pose I worked with that. Okay, chest in front, draw the arm into the socket, and lift the hand last, and you do that pose after pose after pose. I think people get it, and then they build upon their knowledge base. And then they have their practice to ingrain it. And I think people learn. I've seen people learn alignment really well, learn their posture really well, but they have to be patient and compassionate with themselves so that they don't think, tomorrow I'm going to be an expert. There's a lot of information, but it's all available. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, and it's important, as you mentioned as well, that people recognize that like there's a time to it. It just takes familiarity. You don't meet someone for the first time and then spend 24 hours with them and assume you know them because you spent the last 24 hours with them. It's like, okay, well, if I'm spending 1 hour for 24 days, I'm still not going to know them very well. But that time that you've spent over that period of time is probably more valuable than just one full day together instead of seeing each other every day over 24 days or whatever the time may be. But it takes that intimacy that where things really start to shift.
Yeah, I think so. I think it does. Yeah, for the teacher with the student, and also the student starting to understand their own body. Sometimes people spend most of their lives without creating that intimacy with their own body. It's something down there, they're like a head on a stick, and they don't even know what's below them. And just reigniting that connection, I think, is that intimacy too, you're talking.
Oh, well, that's specifically what I meant. I didn't mean even, yes, there's the conversation with the student, the teacher, but I mean the intimacy with our own bodies of I haven't moved in these ranges. I haven't moved from my core. I haven't skillfully lifted my arms over my head in a decade. And now I come into a yoga class. It's like, well, I don't have to be doing everything perfect today. I don't have to have like I got every single cue that the teacher mentioned landed. But rather it's like, okay, I've got a few of these ideas in my bodies. I'm working towards something. something. I'm developing that intimacy with myself, and that's really what kind of allows that flowering. It's not like a forcing it, and okay, I'm just going to crank my body for my hour while I'm thinking about this other thing. And as you said, at that point, you're hurting yourself, and it's not. It's a different sort of practice at that point.
Sure. Right. Yeah. No, I agree.
So do you have anything, kind of based on the things that you see, you talked about the specifics with hinging into the low back or overextending in the low back, the hyperextension. Aside from that, are there things that you see that you could kind of, or some advice that you could give listeners in a kind of a more general and universal sense of something that they could incorporate into their postural practice that could be beneficial to most people listening?
Yeah, sure. Okay, one idea is the foundation of a pose. So creating the foundation for a pose, like building, our body is kind of like a skyscraper in a sense. And, when we construct a skyscraper, we start with the foundation. So even if our feet are off the ground, they're not weight bearing, we're still creating foundations. And what I have found is that there are essentially only two foundations that we form, and they're formed in relation to the position of our hips. One we call the open hip and one we call closed hip. And basically, if the legs come in front of us, like toward the nose and or behind us toward the rear end, forward and back, what we call the sagittal plane of the body, that's a closed hip pose. And poses, like downward facing dog and lunge poses, warrior one pose, Parsvottanasana, the pyramid pose. These are all poses where we try to square our hips to the front of the body, to the front of our mat, and we try to have our feet to whatever degree they can be, because when our feet are, let's say, spread apart, they're not going to be perfect. It's going to be very difficult to get both hips perfectly square. But the alignment is not about arriving anywhere. It's about the intention that we bring. The power, the therapy in a pose is the intention of the pose, not necessarily that we look like we're on the cover of Yoga Journal. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the closed hip pose, our feet have to point as best they can in the same direction of our hips, and our shoulders try to be square to that as best as possible. And then the other position for our hips is what we call open, where the legs come out side to side. We call abduction. So like a triangle pose would be the most classical, or warrior two. And in those poses, we try to keep our shoulders and our hips square with each other, and our feet pointing in the same direction for the most part in relation to the hips. Anyway, what I often find is people have not thought about the pose when they're going in, and whether or not this pose should be a closed hip or open hip pose, and therefore they're not sure, should they be moving towards squaring the hips toward the front of their mat or squaring their hips toward the long side of their mat. And if they're not quite sure, then they're left in kind of akimbo somewhere where they don't really know, well, where do I bring my feet in relation to my hips, or my hips in relation to feet? And if you don't create that good foundation, then the rest of the pose is going to suffer. So we need to basically think that closed hip, should my hips be trying to square to the front? Or open hip, should my hips, like triangle pose, be trying to square toward the long distance of the mat? And once we figure that out, then we establish our good foundation from that position, and then we move forward.
Yeah. Well, and I like kind of adding in something else that you've already said in our chat today to that, is this idea of prioritizing more from the core than out towards the periphery as well. I know a lot of people get super caught up in how wide are my feet supposed to be, or what's the exact angle my back foot's supposed to be. And the anatomical differences of the shape of the thigh bone into the hip socket are such that a lot of that stuff's just going to look different anyways. So as you said, if you're focusing a little bit more towards the core and more towards the hips, I think people will get a lot more from those shapes and from those postures than if they're trying to kind of outwardly adjust and correct, especially as you said, out towards the periphery, out towards what we call the leaves versus the root, that can definitely have some impact as well. Because some people, I mean, for them to put their feet together, they're off balance. Their hips are really wide. Their acetabulums, the hip sockets are way out to the side. So that just doesn't make sense. Vice versa for other people. So it really is nice to when you're working from that structure. I like that you say the open hip and closed hip, because I work a lot in those shapes and differentiate, like, hey, no, I know you could flare your hip open right now, but can we keep it square to the front intentionally? And when we do open it, can we open it intentionally, so we know the difference between those two shapes and how to get in between them and back to one another. So I love that. Honestly, I mean, we could go down the rabbit hole of postures and anatomy all day long. I'm happy to talk about that stuff when I get to go teach the stuff on teacher trainings like you do. I'm sure it's just all weekend long. It's like, oh, I get to talk about anatomy all day and just do this all day. I'm more than happy to. So I would love to continue to chat, but for the sake of time, we're towards the end of our show now. So I want to say, if you've got anything, I know you've got a website and your book. If you want to talk about that stuff, any upcoming projects or workshops, let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and the offerings that you have.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So yes, my website, the easiest address for the website is injuryfreeyogapractice.com. Injuryfreeyogapractice.com. And that's also basically the name of my book on the same subject. It's all about breaking down all the anatomy and alignment principles that we use in our practice, learning how to use the pose to go deeper, but also how to use it in a therapeutic way as well. I teach workshops in a number of places. One of the more recent things is I'll be working with the Shivananda Yoga Ashram over in Grass Valley, California, and I'm on their faculty teaching in their new program. They have a certified yoga therapy program, which will be between 800 to 1,000 hours, depending on your background. But I'll be teaching in the alignment and anatomy department for them. So you can find out information about that through Shivananda. Otherwise, if you go to my website, there'll be a page where upcoming workshops are. There are many in Florida where I live, but also in Arizona, New York, and Costa Rica, and various places. So that's about it. So go to my website, take a look at my book. You can read it. There's a sample chapter there, so you can see what the work's about. And I guess that's about all I need to say about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Steven. You'll have to let me know when you are coming up to Grass Valley, because that's where we live now. So love to connect when you do come up here, and I'll look into some of the stuff you're doing at the Shivananda Ashram. But thank you so much for being on the show today. To all of our listeners out there, I hope you've learned something new, and I hope you have a wonderfully present moment. Thank you so much for listening today. Namaste. Hey everybody, if you have a spare minute, please go over to iTunes, leave us a rating and a review. We really appreciate it. And if you're on Facebook, check out our new Facebook group. It's the same name as our blog, Savannah East. Thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.